Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Dr. Laurie Santos. Laurie is now one of the world's leading, most acclaimed researchers on human happiness. She's a professor at Yale University. And a number of years ago, because of her work as head of college, in which she was very closely living with and in residence with a lot of students, began to see the sort of emotional challenges, difficulties that so many were having, mental health and other emotional challenges. And even though they had all sorts of manner of abundance and opportunities around them. And so she began to wonder how she might be able to be of some help to them. And out of that came one of the leading courses ever taught at Yale. I think something like a quarter of the student body has taken her course. It's just a remarkable number. I've used some of Laurie's research and her findings in writing in one of my classes that I've taught for years. And so I was very pleased to get to talk to Laurie. Great interview, really helpful stuff. As she says, several times in this interview, there are things that we know, and we know them from a lot of different directions and places. We know them from various social science, neuroscience research. We know them from great, grand spiritual traditions, religious traditions. And yet then we just struggle with putting these things into practice. And so I would encourage you, as you think about this, as you listen to this interview, to really ask yourself the question, okay, what does it mean for me to practice some of this stuff? And I would encourage you to take at least one or two things away that you can actually practice out of this remarkable interview with Laurie Santos. Enjoy. Dr. Laurie Santos, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Delighted to have you with us. And I've been especially pleased to have you scheduled for an interview because I've used a lot of your material in classes I taught to undergrads for years. And so it's nice to get to visit with you today. You, as someone who has done a lot of comparative work in cognition, which is not language that is, lay accessible perhaps, but give us some ideas about some of the things that you early on began to discover or compare between dogs, monkeys, and humans, and how that has informed some of your work.
Yeah, well, comparative cognition is just this big field in psychology that explores this question of what makes humans unique, right? How are we different than non-human animals? Why are you and I having this podcast, using verbal language and all the technology of recording, across the way when no amoeba or bonobo is doing anything like that, right? And so for a long time, I was sort of broadly interested in this question of what makes humans special, but I focused on it with a slightly different tendency than many comparative researchers, where I was really interested in this question of whether or not some of the errors that humans make are special. And so we were really interested, for example, in economic errors, things like loss aversion and risk aversion. We did some kind of classic studies with capuchin monkeys showing that, surprisingly, they make a lot of the same errors when it comes to money as humans do, which is interesting. With some of the dogs, what we were finding is that the social errors that people make, kind of being over-trusting or kind of believing and copying the actions of other people, dogs don't seem to make those same errors. And so some of those errors might seem to be unique to humans. And so I like to think that I took a different approach than many comparative researchers, where other researchers were asking, are non-human animals as smart as humans, doing all the cool, smart things that humans do? But we really focused on, do non-human animals share some of the stupid biases that humans have as well?
So what are some of the comparative irrational economic biases or irrational behaviors with regard to money between monkeys and humans?
Yeah. So one of the big ones that we studied was what's broadly known as reference dependence, right? This is just this idea that you're not thinking objectively, you're thinking in terms of a particular reference point. So for example, if you see me holding, one grape and you give me some money and all of a sudden I give you 2 grapes, that feels amazing. But if you see me holding 3 grapes and you pay me some money and I hand you over 2 grapes, even though objectively that's the same amount, you feel like, that's terrible. I could have gotten so much more. Like, why did you take some away from me? And so on. And this is the same kind of bias that we were seeing in our monkeys, that they're making decisions not based on the amount they get, but the amount relative to what they were expecting. And this is a hallmark that's been studied in human economic decision-making since the really famous work of Kahneman and Tversky. This is what Danny Kahneman originally won the Nobel Prize for, was showing that humans have some of these errors and that they play out not just in terms of how we make decisions, but also in terms of how we evaluate risk. So we become more risk-seeking when we're dealing with losses because we think if I could have the chance of not getting less than I expect, then that would be great. And that can sometimes lead us to take on more risk than we'd like to.
So you've used the language of miswanting a great deal. So help us think about how what you've learned about how we miswant with regard to what's going to make us happy.
Yeah, so miswanting is just this idea that we're making decisions in the world in order to maximize our happiness, not kind of willy-nilly. We have some theories about the kind of stuff that will make us happy, right? We often assume it's about our circumstances. If I could hit the Powerball tomorrow, I would be happier, right? If I could get the perfect relationship, some promotion at work for my Yale students, if I could get perfect grades, I would be happier. But we can ask whether or not those theories are correct, right? We can have you make a prediction, what psychologists often call an affective forecast. You forecast how happy you'll be if circumstance A comes out, and then we test when you get circumstance A, how happy are you really? And what many, many studies by folks like Dan Gilbert and others have shown is that our affective forecasts are off. We predict that certain positive things will make us feel, very good and very good for a long time, and they just don't. And interestingly, we predict that negative circumstances will make us feel bad and very bad for a long time, and they simply don't. And this is this phenomena of miswanting. Like, we're making these predictions about the stuff that we want, and interestingly, also the stuff that we don't want to happen in life, assuming that a certain outcome is going to happen. And when you do the research, often what you find is that outcome's wrong. We kind of miswant stuff in the world.
So if you think about that from an evolutionary perspective, what would be maybe one of the reasons that stuff is wired into us?
Yeah, I think we're just bad at just predicting generally. I think it's not so much that evolution wired in a prediction system that's off. I think evolution wired in a whole host of biases that mess us up. So take reference dependence. I think it was really hard for natural selection to wire in, objective truths about, how much food we should get or how many kids we should have or something like that. But a good strategy for natural selection is to say, well, look, I don't know what the environment's going to produce in terms of like the right number of, say, fruit to forage. But, if you get as much fruit as Joe and you get as much fruit as Lucy, then you're doing okay, right? So now we build in something like reference dependence. You're paying attention to what other people have and it's just setting some reference point. And natural selection builds in, no mechanisms to say, oh, you got better than Lucy, good job, feel excited, because that's just a waste. But it builds in lots of mechanisms to say, oh, you didn't do as good as Lucy, like you should work really hard, like you should freak out and have craving and wanting and so on. And so I think those are the kinds of mechanisms that make us miswant, right? It's that we have these kind of ways of viewing the world that are relative to what others are doing. And that means that we're not tracking the objective truths. And if you look at why we miswant, for example, when it comes to money, that's often because we're, in theory, going for some objective amount, like, oh, when I earn $1 million, I'll be happy. But as soon as you get $1 million, now you're hanging out with these other millionaires, you're hanging out with people who are earning more than you, and now you start to feel bad. And so it's not so much that natural selection selected for these kind of bad predictions. It's just that our brains aren't taking into account all the biases we have that are going to make us not appreciate the stuff we get. And because we're not taking those things into account, this is something that Dan Gilbert calls immune neglect. We're not like paying attention to all the processes that are going to get us used to stuff. Now, all of a sudden, because we're not taking that into account, we don't appreciate what we're really going to like and not like in the world.
I mean, that part of what you said there reminds me of a recently interviewed Sonia Lubomirsky. And she was talking about that in her early graduate research. She was looking at particularly unhappy individuals and particularly happy individuals. And what she saw was, she was just doing descriptive work. And what she saw in doing that descriptive work was that the particularly unhappy people regularly compared themselves to others. They're looking up and looking down upon themselves, and that the particularly happy people simply, almost, as she put it, almost didn't even know what you meant when you asked them, do you compare yourselves to others?
Yeah.
And so that seems to resonate, at least in some way, with what you're describing. Is that right?
I think that's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, I think we all have these biases to a certain extent, but the more you, for example, fall prey to these reference points and socially compare, for example, the more you get used to stuff over time, which is another one of these biases, researchers call it hedonic adaptation, the less the good things wind up mattering for you as much as you expect.
Yeah. Another, I think, study that I learned from you was the study of medal winners. Would you describe that study and what we learned from that?
Yeah, very relevant. You and I are having this conversation at the tail end of the Olympics this year. So I literally was just looking at the newspaper and saw a picture of the silver medal and the gold medal. I think they were couples figure skating, and it was like showing this exact effect. And so the effect is that we have these objective rankings in the world, right? The gold medal is just better than the silver medal, which is better than the bronze medal, and those three folks are better than the other billions of people on the planet at whatever their sport is. So you'd expect that emotional expressions on an Olympic stand would reflect those objective ratings, that the gold medalist would be the happiest, silver medal slightly less happy than gold, but still really happy, and the bronze medalist just under that. But when researchers actually went and measured the facial expressions that Olympians were showing on the stand, they didn't find that. Yes, the gold medalist was happy, but if you looked at the silver medalist, they were showing facial expressions like contempt, deep sadness, anger. Like they're kind of not, it's not like they're just like a little bit unhappy. They're actively showing negative emotions. And so you ask like, why? Well, the reason why gets back to these reference points. Like, you're not thinking, if you won the silver medal, you're not thinking, well, I'm objectively the second best on the whole planet, better than billions of people. You're looking to the one person who did better than you and thinking like, crap, that's the very salient reference point.
3/100ths of a second better, and I would be there. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's the salient reference point for silver medalists. And now you might think, well, if we look at the bronze medalists, they should be, even more contemptuous and angry and sad. Turns out, no, if anything, they seem to have even happier expressions than the gold medalist. And so you're like, why? How could that be if they're objectively even worse off? Well, the answer is that the salient reference point for the bronze medalists probably isn't gold. They were multiple people or multiple seconds away. They're probably thinking, oh my gosh, by the skin of my teeth, like I'm on the medal stand at all, 2.2 seconds and I would have missed it and I would have gone home empty-handed. So they are thrilled. And I think this really shows you the power of reference points and also the power of finding, we often talk about finding a silver lining. And I often joke that from this study, we really want to find the bronze lining, right? We want to recognize that there are people doing worse off than us and that there's reason to be grateful for the situation that we find ourselves in.
So let's talk some about maybe some key practices that your research has pointed towards as helping us cultivate happiness. What are some that continue to surface as of most importance to you?
Yeah, for my students, I often break these down into behaviors we can use to feel happier and sort of mindset shifts that we can use to feel happier. And in terms of behaviors, it's just the classic stuff that social scientists have known for a while. A huge one is social connection, right? Pretty much every available study of happy people suggests that happy people are more social, both with their close friends and family members, but also just with folks with whom they have weak ties. The barista at the coffee shop, your neighbor down the street that you see outside when you're, walking the dog. Those kinds of small moments of social connection matter. Also, there's lots of studies suggesting that becoming a little bit more other-oriented makes us happier. And this is something that I think pushes back against the current cultural narrative. The current cultural narrative is all about self-care and treat yourself and me. But studies show that individuals who, for example, donate money to charity are happier than those who don't, controlled for level of income and so on. You find that people who do kind actions for others are happier. And even in experiments where you force people to do nice stuff for others, those folks wind up happier than if you force someone to do the same nice thing for themselves. And so studies really show that kind of getting into the headspace of other people, thinking about other people's happiness is really a path to your own happiness. And then there's behaviors that are just the standard stuff, getting a little exercise, making sure you get enough sleep, getting rest, engaging in what social scientists these days call time affluence, like making sure you have some free time for the things that matter. Those kinds of changes, or behavioral changes, can make a really big difference.
Yeah. Talk more about time affluence that you just mentioned there. What are you learning about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's something that, religious leaders have known for a long time, right? If you look at most religious traditions, they have this idea of the Sabbath or taking a break or having some contemplative time, right? What researchers are learning is the subjective sense that you have some free time matters a lot, right? So if you answer the question, if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, can we get coffee sometime? And you're like, how about never? Because if I look at my schedule, it's just like that hour is never going to fit in there. That has an enormous cost. And studies by Ashley Willens and her colleagues find that if you self-report being the opposite of time affluent, what folks call time famished, where you're like starving for time, that can be as big a hit on your well-being as if you self-report suddenly becoming unemployed.
Huh.
Your listeners who all have jobs right now, if they suddenly became unemployed, that'd be a huge hit on their well-being. Just feeling like you don't have any time is that bad, for your happiness levels. And so I think we need to kind of promote having free time. And this one's an interesting one because I feel like not only do we miswant this, but I think we're often filling our time with lots of stuff that we assume is going to make us happy, and it's not. More hours at work, more accolades, chasing the next promotion, whatever it is, when we might just be better off having a day to rest.
So is there any objective standard in that regard, or again, is this a relative measurement?
Yeah, the funny thing about the definition of time affluence is it's defined as the subjective sense that you have some free time, not the objective amount of time you have. And I think that's helpful because it means we can hack it. And we kind of all know this, like think of the last time at work, like a meeting that you thought was going to be on your calendar for like 2 hours got canceled, but they forgot to tell you. So you show up and you're like, oh no, sorry, no meeting. You just have 2 hours free that you didn't expect.
Yeah.
It's like, I could learn a new language. Like I could go ski. It's like, it's only 2 hours, right? But you feel like, so I think that's the key to time affluence. You don't need to open up a lot of time objectively to feel like subjectively you have some space.
Yeah. What about this notion of good enough? Maybe even the virtue of good enough. What are you seeing and learning about that?
Yeah, I think this winds up being really important in part because it's related to a mindset shift that I talk a lot about with my students, which is sort of fighting self-criticism, fighting perfectionism, fighting this cult of should, right? I think so many of us are walking around with this drill instructor in our head that's screaming at us being like, you need to do more, you should be better, you should. And I joke with my students that this is shoulding all over yourself, right? But I think that coming to terms with the fact that we are not going to live a life where we're going to be perfect. We only have limited time on this planet, and and that means that there's going to be lots of great things that we just can't fit in. And that sucks, but we can have some radical acceptance about that. That's what I think of as this idea of good enough. And I think it can be very hard, especially for the, type A folks that I work with at an Ivy League institution to be like, I'm not going to do more. I'm going to just do it good enough. But that understanding that you are just a human and it's normative to like not be able to do everything, that can be really powerful.
Is that perfectionism something that you've struggled with yourself?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's funny, so many of the things I talk about with my students are ones that I have to work on myself too. And I think perfectionism is a big one. But the studies show it's not just me. There's some lovely studies by Thomas Curran and colleagues just showing how much perfectionism has increased since the 1980s. You get, one of these so-called like hockey stick slopes where it just was flat for a while and all of a sudden it just starts skyrocketing, either because our cultural standards are changing or because, we see these images of perfection on social media that are curated. I think there's lots of reasons for it, but so many of us are beating ourselves up much more than we would have been in the 1960s or 70s.
So when you think about attending to the self, one of our guests, Kristen Neff, down in Texas, has done a lot on self-compassion. How do you see helpful self-compassion as opposed to a sort of deleterious effect upon me?
Yeah, I think this is really critical because I think we often get self-compassion wrong. I adore Kristen Neff's work. It's one of the mindset shifts I focus on a lot with my students. But the thing I think we often get wrong, especially when we hear the term self-compassion, is we often think that it's self-indulgence. Like we often think if I was just kind to myself and wasn't screaming at myself in my head, like I'd never get off the couch, right? I'd just be eating bonbons, on the couch all day or something. But I think one of the things I love about Kristen Neff's work is that she reminds us that self-compassion is treating yourself and talking to yourself like you would a friend. And this is where I think you can realize that self-compassion is not about self-indulgence. If you had a friend that was really messing up, like sitting on the couch all day eating the bonbons, I hope you wouldn't scream at them like a drill instructor, but I hope you wouldn't just be like, oh yeah, you're messing up, that's okay. I hope you'd get curious, be brave, and tackle the problem. Be like, this isn't working. How can we fix this? Like, let's get curious. Let's problem solve. You'd become this kind of compassionate coach who was dealing with the problem, like radically accepting where you've been before, but moving forward to kind of figure out what you can do better. And that's the attitude that you want to take towards yourself. It's not kind of self-indulgence, right? It's not kind of narcissism. You really have to see those problems. You mindfully accept, just sort of step one of Kristen Neff's self-compassion, be mindful, like, this sucks right now. I'm screwing up right now. I'm not in a good place. But then you normalize that, what she calls common humanity. You say, common human experience to go through this every once in a while. Self-kindness. How can I talk to myself like a friend? What can I take off my plate? What do I know about what I need right now? Those questions are really powerful.
Yeah.
But I think this we need to kind of get over this idea that whenever we're talking to ourselves with kindness, that's the same as indulgence. I think in lots of ways it's the opposite of indulgence.
Yeah. I have found that exercise so helpful. And just yesterday I was doing a letter to myself, and again, that same sort of posture. And I have found that so helpful over and over again. What about with regard to loneliness and the loneliness epidemic? What's especially standing out to you that's helpful in your research that are appropriate and fruitful responses to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things there. One is really just that all of us really need self-compassion. All of us really need like social connection for high happiness, right? And I think so many of us are substituting the social connection we normally get in person, in real life, for what we're doing online, right? We're scrolling, we're looking at feeds, and I often say that that's like the NutraSweet of social connection. It kind of gives you the sense that you're connecting, but it's not giving you any psychological nutrition. And so I think kind of finding ways to really prioritize connection is huge. But I also like to give a caveat to that because there's some lovely new work coming out of Michaela Rodriguez's work at the University of Michigan, finding that all this talk of loneliness can sometimes make the alone time we naturally experience and alone time that's normative feel bad. And her work shows that, like, if you recategorize your alone time in a healthier way, like, this is my time for contemplation, or this is my time that I need to emotionally regulate, it can make the time that you spend alone less lonely. And so these days I like to talk about the loneliness work with a little caveat to say, no, that doesn't mean you never want time alone. That's really healthy. And there are better and worse ways to spend time alone. And so I think not only do we have to prioritize social connection, we need to make sure we have the right mindset when it comes to our alone time too.
I guess in some traditions of spiritual formation, they'll speak of the difference between loneliness and solitude, whereas solitude is a sort of helpful posture towards that. So what would you say are, in addition to the learning to frame that time differently, what would be other key steps in letting this be solitude as opposed to loneliness?
Yeah, I think one is kind of taking time for intentional contemplation, right? Whether that's forms of meditation, just kind of being present. I think it's also a great time to make sure you're using that time to emotionally regulate, right? This is your time away from the busyness of the world to take a breath, to notice what's going on, use it wisely. And then I think this is also just like a time that we can use for self-reflection, right? There's these days, of course, a lot of folks are in therapy and using some time to kind of talk through things with friends, but there's also really powerful studies showing the importance of things like expressive writing. You're just sitting down and journaling and thinking through problems, and that can allow you to get the narrative insight you need. And so I think there are ways to use alone time much better. And I think, again, lots of spiritual traditions figured this out, the kinds of things that worked in healthier ways.
So let's step back just a moment and ask some 30,000-foot questions. When you think about the word happiness or the phrase well-being, how do you define those? What does that mean for you? Yeah,
so I know you had Sonia Lyubomirsky on the show recently, and I totally steal Sonia's definition. So she defines happiness as being happy in your life and being happy with your life. And this is in part because psychologists like to think of happiness as having an affective component, right? The kind of emotional part, that's sort of being happy in your life, having a decent number of positive emotions, right? And also a cognitive part of happiness, how you think your life is going, right? That's sort of being happy with your life. And I think it's worth one of the reasons I like this definition is that you can notice times in life when these dissociate, right? There's times where you're really pushing to something that feels really meaningful for you, but you have to get rid of some hedonic pleasure and some positive emotion to do that well, right? And I think we all have heard, and spiritual traditions are ripe with the opposite balance, right? With people who are getting every single hedonic pleasure, but when it comes to meaning in life or a sense of purpose or thinking your life is going well, you don't have it, right? Those definitions I like, in part because they're good standards for the interventions of the kind that I talk about, these behaviors and mindset shifts that matter for happiness. We can measure those things pretty well. Like we can ask people, are you happy in your life? And all things considered, how do you feel your life is going? But I think it's in some ways a narrow definition when we start thinking more spiritually about, in some sense, what somebody like Aristotle might have meant by happiness, right? A sense of eudaimonia, sort of living a good life and so on. I think that the word happiness also leads us to a particular confusion. And there are interesting studies about this, that when most people use the term happiness, they mean that first affective part of happiness. They mean feeling good in your life. They almost confuse happiness with like a sense of joy or just broadly any positive emotion, not thinking about the purpose part or the meaning part or the kind of the deeper part of happiness. So all these terms are not great. And I think that's one of the reasons psychologists have used well-being. They're like, oh, we'll just pick a different word that means what we say it means to not confuse people. But I'm not sure it has helped.
Are there in your field non-subjective standards or measurements for happiness or well-being?
Yeah, I wish there were better ones. I mean, the problem is it's a subjective state, right? So let's say we got some, less subjective standard. We can measure somebody's cortisol, right, which is a stress hormone, and say, maybe we use that as a measure for happiness. But ultimately, to know that that more objective measure maps onto people's subjective state, we got to ask them about their subjective state and do a correlation, right? And so even the broader metrics we use, and there are some, measures of hormones, we can look at, neural firing in certain areas or whatever, but all of those wind up, being validated by just asking people, how are you feeling in your life? And all things considered, are you happy with your life? So I wish there was a little thermometer we could put in people's mouths to tell us like, oh, you're 98.6, happy or whatever. But that's just not how this state works.
Right. What do you think about, there's often people will make a very sharp distinction between joy and happiness. And I'll show my hand and say, while I think I understand why people want to make that sharp distinction, I increasingly have questioned it. But I don't know. What do you make of that distinction?
I get that question a lot. And with the definition I'm using, it's harder, right? Because I'm like, well, joy is kind of a form of feeling happy in your life, maybe less broad, right? And I think it's interestingly sustained, right? When you experience the emotion of joy, you often are feeling like your life is pretty positive. So it changes your cognitive part of happiness. But I think of them as different things. I think one thing that doing this work has taught me is that, like, especially as Americans, we are just so impoverished when it comes to our emotional language to talk about these different subjective states. For example, in English, we have very few emotional words for forms of happiness that are kind of a little low affect, right? So, the emotions we have a valence, whether they're more positive and negative, although even that is fraught of, like, there's lots of things like that feel bittersweet that have a positive and negative component. But emotions seem to have a valence, but they also seem to have kind of an arousal level, or you kind of a really high, arousal positive emotion like ecstasy, or do you have a really low like arousal positive emotion, something like contemplation or, equanimity or something like that, right? And I just think we just don't, we pick those words out, but we don't talk a lot about different forms of this stuff. So I think when people go to positive emotion, they're like, what about joy? I'm like, okay, that's one we use a lot, but like there are other ones we should focus on too.
Yeah. The G.I. Joe fallacy, that it doesn't necessarily help you. So help us with that.
Yeah, so this is a concept I worked on with my colleague Tamar Gendler, the philosopher, and it stems from a bad 80s cartoon that your listeners may or may not remember called G.I. Joe, which was a cartoon about army guys. I think nobody really remembers what happened in the cartoon, but what people remember is at the end of every episode, they had this little public service announcement where they taught kids in the 80s things like, don't talk to strangers and look both ways when you cross. It was very kind of quaint when you look back at some of these videos. But at the end of the public service announcement, the kid who was learning whatever G.I. Joe was teaching would often say, "Thank you, G.I. Joe, now I know." And G.I. Joe would say, "And knowing is half the battle." And we'll go, "G.I. Joe." If you remember that. But this is the idea, right? This idea is knowing is half the battle.
Yeah.
I know what I'm supposed to do to feel happier, and like I'm done. But, so much work suggests that you're not done. It's one thing to know what you're supposed to do, the behaviors you're supposed to enact or the mindsets you're supposed to enact in a situation. But it's another thing to put those things into practice. We know these things, of course, when it comes to our physical health. So many of us know that we should be, eating more green leafy vegetables and getting the right recommended amount of sleep and exercise. But that doesn't necessarily translate into doing that in your daily life. And I think so many of the happiness things we've been talking about are like that. You might hear all the news reports about loneliness and social connection. That doesn't mean that when you get home from a busy day, rather than plopping on the couch and scrolling, you're going to call a friend, and have a long, fun chat on the phone or over like FaceTime or something like that. You really need to put in some work to make these strategies happen in your own life.
So what's the golden ticket to doing it?
I wish there was one. This is another domain. I mean, research in this field of behavior change struggle a lot. Again, not just with happiness, right?
Yeah.
If we knew how to get people who knew how much green leafy vegetables they should eat to eat them, doctors would be out of business, right? Because we'd be like a lot healthier. Behavior change is really hard. But ways to do it are, first of all, to, I think, know the science, right? I think it at least has helped me know some of these studies and realize, wow, this isn't just like, people say this or a platitude. Like I can see the graph of, how happy I'll be if I'm hanging out with friends regularly versus not, right? I think that is actually helpful. I think there's also lots of evidence for the power of habits. Something else Aristotle knew very well, that if you just do these behaviors over and over again, that becomes your character, right? That becomes the thing that you do regularly. And the science of habits shows that the more you do this stuff, the easier it becomes to do it, the less friction there is every time you're putting into one of these habits into practice. Finally, again, something else Aristotle knew, which is that if we engage in social support, these things become easier. So if your family members are engaging in gratitude at the table, or if you have a religious group that's going to work with you and pray and meditate, or if you have a community group that's getting together regularly, you can harness social support to put these behaviors, these positive behaviors into practice. So those are some of the techniques we teach, but we do not have the magic pill for behavior change.
Yeah.
It'd be so great if we did.
It would be great if you did. Or would it? I mean, I don't know. Yeah. So, I mean, you've alluded to Aristotle a couple of times. How do you think of the work that you do being in continuity with Aristotelian virtue theory, virtue tradition, or other virtue traditions? And how do you see there being discontinuity, if any?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the scientific work in the field of, positive psychology, happiness studies, whatever, really winds up verifying a lot of the stuff that we've known from spiritual traditions for a long time, right? I put Aristotle in that category. I put Epictetus in that category. I put a lot of Buddhist traditions in that category, a lot of Christian traditions. I mean, even if you look at the stuff we've just been talking about, like time affluence, there are Sabbaths, there are rest, self-compassion, compassion is the type of thing, both for ourselves and others, that many spiritual traditions talk about. Grace in the Catholic tradition, right? If you look at social connection, even if religious traditions aren't preaching about it, most religious practices are having you engage in it, where you go to services with other people and so on. And so many of these practices that I'm telling my students in their homework, like, hey, you have to do this, religious traditions both talk about the importance of and have practices that make it easier for you to execute those things. And so I think of much of this work as really kind of tied with some of these principles. But in some ways, it didn't have to be that way, right? Like the nice thing about the science is we can do the experiment to ask, is this really helping? Is it really moving the needle? And often we find that it is, but, it didn't have to go that direction.
So how do you, this is another question I asked Sonia Lubermisky, but how do you think about over-instrumentalizing these practices in such a way that it may corrupt them? I mean, so I think, okay, if I'm kind, I'll be happy, so I'm going to go be kind. Yeah. And so then all of a sudden there's this possibility that I have, used, say, my my elderly parents because I say, well, I'm going to especially be kind to my parents today when I've just used them for my own sake. How do you think about that danger of instrumentalization?
Yeah, I think one of the problems is we get the form of that instrumentalization wrong, right? You're like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to donate money to this charity because it's going to make me happy. But then in the act of doing that, you're missing the parts that make you happier, which is like noticing that it's really helping people and doing it out of a kindness motivation and so on, right? I think oftentimes when we instrumentalize stuff, that comes with all the negative habits we bring to so many of the instrumental things we do in our lives. Like we beat ourselves up over it. We have standards for how we're going to do it. We don't meet those objective standards. It becomes very shouldy, which makes us feel yucky. And so I think there's a deeper spiritual worry, like we're kind of doing the good life for the wrong reasons. But I think there's, a worry that psychologists might have, which is like, if you're instrumentalizing too much, you're just like not going to get it right.
Yeah.
And you're actually not going to get the benefit of these things.
I mean, one of the ways I think that overlaps, again, with virtue traditions, or, go back to Aristotle, he's always going to insist that a virtue is a practice that must be done in the right way, in the right time, the right way, and so forth. So it carries with it a practical wisdom, and that practical wisdom can't necessarily be defined in concrete, specific terms for every situation, but it's always something that you learn. It becomes a sort of inbred practice that you have, and so it's you would learn that there are better and worse ways to practice kindness. That's right. Precisely attentive to the kinds of things that you're pointing us towards there. Are you naturally happy?
Not before I started all this stuff. I feel like Sonia's often talked about the fact that happiness is heritable, right? Some of the variants that we see in the population can be explained by something like your genes or your biology. And I think I not, hit the genetic lottery when it comes to being happy. I think my natural tendency is not to do a lot of these behaviors and mindset practices that I teach my students. But, like all good preachers, I have to practice what I preach, right?
Yeah.
So I end up doing these things more in part because I'm thinking about them. And I have seen a big difference in my own happiness over time.
Yeah.
Mostly because I'm like doing all the stuff that we know seems to work.
Does it put a special weight upon you to know that, hey, I'm the happiness expert. I'm one of the leading happiness experts in the world, and thus, I can just imagine there's a certain weight with that. What's that been like for you?
There is. I chat with my colleague Ethan Cross, who's another psychologist who studies this stuff. He's really an expert on emotion regulation. We talk about we're kind of cursed, right?
Right.
Because we're like an extreme version of this G.I. Joe fallacy. We are the people who are publishing papers, telling people what they should know to do. But that still for us doesn't mean that it comes into practice easily. And so, so it can be a little tricky.
Yeah.
The good news is that comes with the forms of social pressure and lots of reminders to do this stuff. So I have kind of, in some sense, extreme social support of people reminding me about habits that are important to do. That doesn't always come, without some embarrassment or humor. I often joke, my co-creator and podcast producer, Ryan Dilley, who's really involved in the early happiness lab, I'll often be just like texting him about something and complaining. And he'll be like, if only there was a podcast episode that could help us with that, I'm like, no, so yeah.
Yes. What about burnout? What have you learned about, the need? I guess in some ways that just goes back to time affluence or lack thereof. But I don't know. How have you thought about that?
Well, burnout is a funny term. It's another one of these terms culturally that's tossed out a lot, but in clinical spaces means a very specific thing. And so burnout isn't just kind of like, I'm feeling too tired or whatever. Clinically, according to work by Christina Maslach and colleagues, it has these 3 particular symptoms. So symptom number 1 is what's called emotional exhaustion. Not just you're tired, but you can't emotionally handle putting one more thing on your plate. Even if you had a really great night's rest or a week-long vacation, like you still would come back feeling just as kind of emotionally tired. That's sort of symptom number 1. Symptom number 2 is what she calls depersonalization, but it's basically a form of cynicism. You start to read negative intentions into everybody that you're working with, your clients, the people on your team. You're just like, that person's getting on your last nerve. And that's a real symptom of burnout, number 2. Symptom of burnout, number 3, is what Maslach calls a sense of personal ineffectiveness, which is this idea that like, even if you did your job perfectly, it would just be bad, or it wouldn't work well, or just wouldn't be worth it. I think classic cases of burnout people hear about in the healthcare field, right? Think about, nurses who are, just feeling exhausted, getting annoyed with their patients, but more feeling like their job is a big mismatch with the values they came into it for. I came in to help people heal and feel better, but I'm filling out insurance forms, or I'm canceling care, or, giving, medicines that pharmaceutical companies are pushing me to give, whatever it is, right? The idea is that the job you had, what you wanted to be doing, is kind of mismatched with what you ultimately want to do. That's really what burnout is. And it's important to note that burnout isn't just your psychology. It's often in an interaction with the form of work you're doing, whether that's work at a job, but it could be, caregiving for elderly parents, or, kind of doing a volunteer job where these things get mismatched. It's really you interacting with an institution. And that's important because when you think about solving for burnout, you often have to solve for those mismatches with what's going on at your work.
So in bringing in this question of relationship to institutions, or even more broadly, social conditions, talk to us about this so-called weird science bias, and how, I don't know much about this, but my understanding is that this is one of the critiques of positive psychology, is that maybe the demographic against which we are asking these questions, or from which we are asking these questions, might be a bit narrow. So help us think through some of that.
Yeah, so WEIRD is an acronym that researchers like Joe Heinrich at Harvard have used to describe the typical subjects of studies. So it stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. The undergraduate students at institutions like mine that tend to be the ones we test, right? And the problem with testing those folks is that the interpretation is often not about Western, educated, Yale undergraduates, this is what happens if they write in a gratitude journal. The idea is here's what happens for people, everywhere if they write in a gratitude journal. And of course, at times that assumption is wrong, right? Now, I think sometimes these weird biases get thrown at psychologists who are kind of yeah, we know obviously we wouldn't just test, Yale undergraduates if it was easy to, test people around the world and in different kinds of societies and so on. I think this is something psychologists know, but it can be hard logistically to fix. The best kinds of studies are the ones that use methods that allow for these huge data sets, often international data sets that are testing people around the world. And I think more and more positive psychologists are starting to partner up with teams who have access to those data sets. So for example, the World Happiness Report, which is a big report that looks at factors that matter for happiness around the world, is able to test more than 200 different countries. And they do kind of nationally representative samples in all those countries. So they're really able to say no, when we find something with the World Happiness Gallup data set, this isn't weird, right? This is kind of everybody we could possibly test that we can have access to. And some of those new studies are bearing out the sorts of things that we've just been talking about. For example, this Lara Aknin has some really lovely work looking at the connection between donations and happiness across the world. And she finds that I think it's true in over 96% of countries that have been tested, basically show the pattern that weird subjects show, which is the more nice things you do, the happier you are. And so I think we're getting more and more of these data sets that look at these different phenomena cross-culturally. So it's a critique that I think is important to remember, but a lot of the folks listening to your podcast, for better or for worse, are weird,
right?
Not weird, from weird places. And so, so we want to know these things generalize, but sometimes they wind up generalizing in ways that we expect.
So how do you think then about the importance of playing out extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, say in this case, to be kind or to be generous? Where does the line fall for whether that's helpful or not for a person's happiness?
Yeah, this is a problem for one of the mechanisms we use for behavior change, right? So one of the mechanisms we use for behavior change is let's pick in the physical health domain, right? I want to run more. I want to get more physical activity. I know I'll buy one of these tracker devices and I'll, give myself a little bing and a gold star every time I get the workout in, right? In theory, this is useful for behavior change, but psychologists since the 1950s have known that it has a nasty effect on your motivation, which is that when you slap an extrinsic reward on something that used to be intrinsically motivated, it can decrease the intrinsic motivation you get, What do I mean? I used to like running and I wanted to go running for the kind of runner's high, but now I'm getting this little ding on my Fitbit or whatever the tracker device is. And now I'm only doing it for the Fitbit, right? Which means I cheat, right? You know, if I have friends who do this who like, I'm just going to walk back and forth in the room and like shake my arm a lot. So the tracker thinks I'm like, you know, moving around a little bit, right? You know, that's a funny domain of like, you know, moving physically, but like I see this in the connection with grades, right? You know, there's real worry that students are doing things to get the perfect grade, not for the ultimate intrinsic goal, which is learning the material, you know, this sort of nice feeling that you get when you learn stuff. There's a real danger of this with the happiness work too, right? You know, if you're giving yourself little gold stars of like, oh, I meditated today, or I wrote in my gratitude journal, or whatever, all of a sudden that's going to reduce your motivation to do it naturally and might even sap some of the little happiness boost that you get from some of these things. I think the extrinsic motivators also come with all the kind of the approach that we have that comes with all these shoulds and I have to and these kinds of things, which can also make these things feel a little bit yucky over time. So I think the key is that whenever possible, you want to honor the intrinsic motivation that you're getting from these things. Really take time to notice that and use that as the reinforcer that causes you to do a behavior more.
What about the quest to be happy all the time or toxic positivity? What are you learning about that?
Yeah, and I think this gets back even to our definition of happiness, right? It's sort of partly about being happy in your life. And I think people can mistake that for being happy in your life all the time, like every moment of every day, right? This is this idea of toxic positivity that any negative emotion is like, ooh, I'm feeling sad, something's wrong. I need a pill, I need to fix that, right? But pretty much everything we know about human psychology suggests that negative emotions are normative, right? It is normal in the midst of our attention economy to feel overwhelmed sometimes. It is normal with the current news cycle to occasionally feel frustrated or anxious or sad, right? It is normal in the face of like the kinds of big pressures that we're facing to feel negative sometimes. But we don't like those negative emotions. And so our move is to suppress them or think, you know, in these toxic positive thoughts like something's wrong, I got to get rid of them. And I think a much healthier way to think about our negative emotions is to realize that they are useful, normative signals. The way I tell my Yale students about negative emotions, I say treat them like the dashboard on your car. You know, if you're driving in your car and the engine light comes on or the tire light comes on, that's inconvenient, doesn't feel great, but it's giving you some useful information, which is like something's up with the tire. I got to take some time later, you know, after this drive to like check it out and fix it. And I think our sense of loneliness is like that. It's like, ooh, I might need to get in some social connections. Sadness suggests there's something wrong in the world you might want to pay attention to or notice, right? Overwhelm, a big one, that means, whoa, something's wrong. I got to take something off my plate. These are signals that our body is using to tell us something's not in equilibrium here and we need to change things around.
How do you consider the relationship between, let's say, disordered desire and thus unhelpful information from our emotions? Am I making sense?
Yeah, totally. So I think there's a way to think of like the negative states we want to honor, right? Like loneliness or sadness or something like that. And the negative states that are coming from the miswanting, right? Like, oh, I need that promotion or kind of craving and so on. And this is a spot where I think understanding some of these biases can really help us. And also the kind of contemplative practices that folks talk about, you know, like Buddhists will notice that there's, you know, what is it, tanha, the kind of sense of craving, but they say, oh, that's not a negative state I should listen to. That's a negative state I should work to notice and radically accept and regulate, as opposed to maybe something like loneliness where you might realize like, oh, this is like a need that's not being filled, right? And I think in other domains, we can start to figure this out. We can tell the difference between real hunger, like I haven't eaten something in a long time, I need to get some calories in my body, and like a craving of like, oh, that cupcake on the table, you know, on the desk right now looks really good, I should have it, right? But that takes a lot of mindfulness, a lot of noticing, a lot of paying attention to your own body's signals to distinguish the two.
Yeah. And then how does all this play into grief? What's the research showing about helpful and or unhelpful practices of grief?
Yeah, well, I think grief is one of these practices where it is normative, right? It is normative if you've lost someone to feel sad about them. It's normative if you have a connection to want to honor that connection over time, have memories of that person, and so on. These are the kinds of things we want to build into, a healthy, happy community. But there's a time and place for some of these things. It might come with some strategies for regulating emotions, so that, if I was interviewing one of my podcast guests who was talking about grief, that said the worst moment of grief she experienced was she was just like picking out yogurt at the store and realized she wouldn't need the 4-pack anymore because her partner had just died, and literally like collapsed to the floor in the grocery store and was bawling, crying. Like, not ideal, right? And so I think we want to honor those healthy negative emotions like grief, but also have strategies for regulating them so that we can experience them at the right time and place. And I really do like these strategies of kind of making space for negative emotions. The meditation teacher Tara Brach has a practice that she calls RAIN, which is an acronym that stands for recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture, which is a practice where you're really supposed to like, hey, let me sit with my grief right now. Or I'm like really frustrated with this work colleague. Let me take time to sit down with my frustration. Or, I'm feeling just really upset and anxious about what's happening in the world right now. Let me take time to sit down and sit with that and kind of give your negative emotions space so that you can honor that and use them in the productive ways that they're there, but kind of find ways to regulate them and have that at the right time and place.
Are there any, you've noted a few already, but are there other kind of social trends that you think are especially damaging to our pursuit of these helpful practices of well-being?
Well, I'll tell you one that I see on social media all the time that gets me so angry, but because I think it's wrong. It's dangerously wrong, but like everyone loves it, which is this practice of manifesting. So this is like right now it's like, oh, just think about getting money or the perfect relationship and you'll kind of manifest it. And the reason I really don't like this one is that it's kind of nuanced because there is evidence from positive psychology about the power of positive belief, right? Believing that something is possible, optimism, hope, these are great things. Right. And we've known this for a long time. There's a very famous effect, speaking of kind of athletes, called the Bannister effect, which is named after Roger Bannister, who was the first runner to ever run the 4-minute mile. And the reason his story is interesting is like nobody believed it was physically possible for a human body to run the 4-minute mile. Bannister was a doctor and he was like, no, I think bodies can do this. And he finally, believed it was possible, ran it and did it and was like, oh my God, we thought that was impossible, but it is apparently possible. And what's interesting was like in the months that passed, several other runners started running the 4-minute mile. So this thing that no one had ever done for decades, now all of a sudden lots of people do it. And I think, if you're a runner, it's not even that impressive to have done that anymore, right? That's the power of belief. If you believe something's possible, it makes it more achievable. But there's a danger to the particular form that all these manifestor people talk about, how you're supposed to think about positive beliefs, which isn't just believing it's possible. It's visualizing all the rewards you'll get from it, right? So it's like, oh, if I could get the perfect partner, then if somebody to give a Valentine's Day gift to it, it'd be so great and I'd love it so much. This is a problem because we know that imagined rewards in the mind and brain work a lot like real rewards. So there's these studies by Carrie Morwedge and others that if you either imagine slowly putting quarters, into a vending machine versus slowly eating M&Ms one by one, those forms of imagining have a different consequence. If I later give you a big bowl of M&Ms and you've been imagining eating those M&Ms one by one, you don't want any more because your brain already thinks you've gotten those rewards. And this is the danger of manifesting. If you're like, oh my God, this is the wonderful thing that would happen if I got a new relationship, or this is the wonderful thing that would happen if I got a perfect grade on my midterm, your brain thinks you already got that reward. And there's studies by Gabrielle Oettingen and colleagues that show you'll put in less work to do that reward.
Okay, that's bizarre. I've never heard this before. That's just fascinating.
Yeah. So she finds that, for example, the women who have the most positive fantasies about weight loss, like thinking, oh, it's going to be so great, they do the less stuff to get to weight loss. The students who have the most positive fantasies about getting good grades do less stuff to get them. And again, it makes sense. If your reward areas think like, I already got that reward, I'm good, then you don't have to put the time in. And so this is the danger of manifesting. It's this really subtle distinction. Like you want the hope, you want to believe it's possible, but don't just spend your time fantasizing about the rewards. Oettingen's work finds if you just take one other step, it's great. great, which is that you use your imagination to think about the obstacles. So I'm thinking like, oh, it'd be so great if I got fit. There'd be all these benefits. But what's holding me back? I don't have a gym membership or like, I don't have any workout shoes. You realize like, oh, I can solve this obstacle with this if-then plan, right? And so yeah, so sorry, you got me going on manifesting.
No, that's
it's
just so
everywhere on
fascinating.
social media. Yeah. It's a subtle distinction of how to do it right? So the positive part, great. The rewards even aren't so bad if you follow it up with like, okay, what's holding me back? And then you use your imagination to come up with good solutions, a good plan.
Fascinating. So I'm also wondering then if I could hack this. So for example, I have this disordered desire for dark chocolate covered almonds with turbinado sugar and sea salt from Trader Joe's.
Yep.
I love those things.
I know exactly the little plastic box you're talking about. I'm with you on this obsession. Yes, yeah.
And, so my wife gave me one of those for Valentine's Day. And then we pulled them out the next night to have some over dinner. And she said, who ate all of these? And of course, we knew who ate all of them, me. But I hear you saying maybe that would be one thing I could experiment with is if I spend a little bit of time thinking ahead of time about eating them, then maybe I'll have less desire to eat them.
Yeah, it's kind of like imagine what you're going to feel like when you're done if you really play out the fantasy. And again, I think it's a not good desire, right? A desire that you ultimately your kind of very high level conscious self would want to curb.
Right.
You probably notice like, oh, I feel gross, and like my wife's going to walk in and see the empty plastic container, and I'm going to have to blame it on the dog. It's not going to work. When you play out fantasies that don't work, sometimes that can be helpful too. And Oettingen talks about this. She says sometimes when you really do this positive thinking correctly, you realize, it'd be so great if I lost all this weight. Well, what do I really need to do? Well, I got to go to the gym every day. I have other goals that I'm working on right now. Maybe I'm trying to learn a language, or maybe I'm trying to spend time with my husband. Like maybe I need to be nicer about my goal. Maybe I need to get more realistic about what's actually possible, right? And so it allows you to not just have these fantasy goals that are not grounded in reality, but really think about what the consequences are actually going to be for your behaviors.
Yeah. What's possible, and then what would be practical next steps towards that. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Very helpful. Let me go back to the very beginning for you. What do you suspect in your life history led you to do the research that you've done?
Well, a lot of it was just an experience of pain that I went through seeing the mental health struggle that my students were facing. So I was kind of, doing these comparative studies or wondering about the human mind, going along well. When I took on this new role on Yale's campus, I became what's called a head of college. So this is a faculty member who lives on campus with students. And I just saw what everybody's talking about in the news, right? Where nationally, more than 40% of college students are too depressed to function most days. Nationally, more than 60% of college students say they're overwhelmingly anxious. Nationally, more than 1 in 10 college students has seriously considered suicide in the last 6 months, right? Like these are statistics that are thrown around nationally. And I was seeing this in my community, right? And just realized like, wow, somebody needs to help these students. And also kind of felt a little bit like my field has these answers, often in a form that I think the students resonate with, where they want to see the evidence and they want to see the graph. It wasn't just like platitudes. And I was like, but we're not doing such a great job of sharing these strategies. And so the switch to thinking about the science of well-being really happened in an attempt to help the students and a little bit to help myself, because when I was thinking about these students, I was realizing I wasn't doing such a hot example of showing how I was following all these strategies too.
Yeah. And so in that work, what are you seeing that now gives you some hope about the trajectories, and what is the most significant concerns for you that you're not seeing traction that you would like to see?
Yeah, well, the hopeful part is that if you do this stuff, you'll feel better, right? Like, my colleague Dan Harris, who's been on my podcast a lot, has this book called 10% Happier. And that's really what a lot of the effect size the studies show, right? If you engage in this stuff, you'll go from a 7 to an 8 or a 5 to a 6, right? Like you'll see movement of about that form. And that's really hopeful, right? I think that means we can move the needle for people who are really struggling in a way that makes a big difference. In terms of the spots where I'm worried, there's so much of our natural biases tend to lead us astray when it comes to the stuff that makes us happier. And I think emerging technologies haven't helped that. So many of the strategies we talk about, whether that's being present or being grateful or curbing your social comparison, that all gets harder when you've got a cell phone around you looking at stuff on social media. And I worry that so much of the things that allow us to get flow and flourishing are going to get even harder in the face of the AI tools that are coming up, right?
Yeah.
A frictionless chatbot that, always is very sycophantic to you and you never have to schedule with, right? It's going to be easier than like calling a friend over time or, getting a real relationship partner that you can hang out with. The temptation to just get all your work done with these tools rather than get the flow that comes from pushing through a hard essay or a hard, thing at work. I worry that a lot of these tools coming up are going to be even more of a challenge when it comes to some of these strategies.
Yeah.
But ultimately, good news is we know what to do. We know what works. We just have to figure out good ways to put it into practice.
So I imagine a listener and says, okay, yeah, I hear all this. It all sounds right and resonates, but I feel overwhelmed. Tell me where to start. What's the next one or two steps?
Yeah, I get this question. I mean, I deal with my type A students who are like, you told me 15 tips. I don't have time for 15 tips. Give me the one,
Yeah.
My advice is often, as you're hearing these tips, there's some stuff that you, just because of individual differences, you kind of do naturally. Maybe you're like, oh yeah, exercise and sleep, I got that. But self-compassion, I struggle with that, right? You're going to move the needle the most on the tip that you felt most called out by. Like the one that you're like, oh, I'm not doing that myself. That's where if you engage a little bit more, you'll move the needle. In part because you're probably not doing it very much. And so even a little bit helps. But I think a second thing to remind yourself is this strategy of self-compassion and common humanity. You're not going to be able to do everything. Like we're all feeling overwhelmed. What little baby steps can you take to make progress? Just, to protect from beating yourself up. You don't want to beat yourself up to do these happiness strategies either. And the great news is these baby steps matter, Scribbling in your gratitude journal 3 times a week can move the needle, right? A little 10 minutes of meditation can move the needle. Like a quick chat with the barista at the coffee shop can move the needle, right? So you don't need a lot of time to do these things. You need some intention, but definitely finding ways to do it in baby steps is a helpful, healthy way to engage in these practices.
Been talking to Dr. Laurie Santos, one of the world's leading researchers on happiness and the science of well-being. Laurie, thanks so much for your time and thanks so much for your work and the beautiful contribution it is to our world.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on the show.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.